Okay, so I'm recording the second one simultaneously with the first one. So I'm going to go into some of the things that I've seen people ask on the subreddit and things that people have asked on the Discord channel. The first one, can I jailbreak? Well, more than likely you're on iOS 15. If you are on iOS 15, and I showed this in the previous video, there is no tool available for iOS 15. Whether you're on 15.1, the latest version, 15.6.1, 15.4.1, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have an iPhone 10 or an iPhone 6S. It does not matter. Or an iPhone 11. It does not matter one bit. And even says right here for the devices, there's no tool available. You cannot jailbreak. Now, if you were on iOS 14, that is a possibility. There are jailbreaks for iOS 14. And you're probably going to ask, well, can I downgrade to iOS 14? Because I'm on iOS 15.x. Can I downgrade to iOS 14? Well, without a jailbreak, it's a little tricky. So like I said in the previous video, so A5 to A11 is vulnerable to the Checkmate exploit, and the current devices that are Checkmate vulnerable and support iOS 15 are, I believe, the iPhone 6S, the iPhone 7, and the iPhone 8 and 10, if I recall correctly. So those devices are Checkmate vulnerable and they support iOS 15. Now, if you have blobs, now don't quote me on this part, but if you have blobs, you should be able to downgrade those devices to 14.8.1 or 14.8. I don't know about anything lower. I don't know if that would work, but I do know that for 14.8 and for 14.8.1, it will break Face ID. And even on checkra on A11, you'll still have to have the passcode disabled. I believe on A10 as well, iPhone 7, 6S, it will also break Touch ID. Now, don't quote me on that part, but that is from what I recall. Now you're probably wondering, well, what are blobs? Well, I'll show you. Here we go. SHSH blobs. Okay. So, I'd also like to backtrack a little bit. You're probably wondering, well, I have an iPhone XS, I have an iPhone 11, I have an iPhone 12, I have an iPhone 13. Well, for those devices, those are not Checkmate vulnerable. So, even if you have blobs, for, say, 14.8, you cannot downgrade because there's no jailbreak available. With Checkmate, it's different. The exploit allows you to jailbreak. There's a lot of information that I've got to cover here. And, the thing with jailbreaking is it's very, at least nowadays, it's very convoluted. So there's a lot going into this, and you'll really have to pay attention. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what are blobs? Okay, well, blobs are SHSH blobs. So SHSH blobs, in the easiest terms, I mean, iPhone Wiki describes it here. It's a signature. It's a signature that the bootloader will verify before allowing execution of an image. So essentially, how it works is you save your SHSH blobs via a signing service. I don't know if I have it pinned here. Do I not have it pinned here? I'm surprised I don't have it pinned here. Well, anyway, so essentially what you do is, let's say you've got an iPhone 10 or 10s, or just say iPhone 10s. Let's say you've got an iPhone 10s on 15.1.1. And let's go back in time a little bit. Let's just say 15.1.1 is being signed. Now, the way that Apple does these things is they actually sign these firmwares. So, and I understand I'm probably going all over the place, I apologize. But let's go back here. So Apple signs their firmwares, their versions of iOS. So if we go to iPhone, and then let's just do iPhone 11. iPhone 11. So The current version signed for iPhone 11 is 15.6.1. That's the latest version. Now, if you say, well, you said that iOS 15.1 should be able to get a jailbreak soon. Well, you can't downgrade to that because right here, it's unsigned. So if you download the IPSW and try to downgrade via iTunes, the IPSW is just the firmware file, and you try to downgrade in iTunes, iTunes is going to say, it's going to communicate with Apple servers, and it's going to say, hey, I've got an iPhone 11 here, and I want to downgrade to 15.1. I want to downgrade it to 15.1. Is this version signed at all? And then Apple servers are going to come back and say, nope, it's not signed anymore. Sorry, you can't downgrade to it, and it's going to reject the firmware. If it's signed, then it's like a passport, basically. It's like a passport that expires. Now, if you try this with 15.6.1, then Apple servers will say, oh yeah, it's signed. You can restore to that firmware. It's fine. Now, if you have blobs, essentially it's like having a fake passport, and that's probably not even the most accurate term. It's probably a little off, but I'm trying to simplify things a little bit. So if you were on 15.1 in the past, so October 2021 was when 15.1 was released, and let's say you saved blobs for that firmware when it was being signed. You can only save blobs when the firmware is being signed. So you save blobs 15.1. For 15.1, and then later, let's say you upgraded to 15.6.1, and again, I'm using the iPhone 11 as an example, and you said, well, I want to downgrade to 15.1. Now the kicker here is that again, for the iPhone 11 is not checkmate vulnerable, so if you wanted to downgrade to 15.1, you would still need a jailbreak, which just defeats the purpose. Now, if you have an iPhone 10 or lower and you save 15.1 blobs when it was being signed and you're on 15.6.1 now, well, it's checkmate vulnerable. It's vulnerable to that boot ROM exploit. So you can use that to set the nonce, and the nonce is essentially, it's a random generator. It's essentially a random generator. Your device already has it. It already has it. And the reason why on non-checkmate vulnerable devices you need it is you need a jailbreak is so that you can set the nonce on your device to match the one that was on your SSH blob for 15.1. Now, on an iPhone 10 that's checkmate vulnerable, you don't need a jailbreak because the boot ROM exploit will allow you to set the nonce. So you'd set a nonce with I don't know if you can set the nonce on Windows, but I know on Mac. On Mac OS you can pawn, and again you can like pawn your iPhone 10 with the checkmate exploit. You can set the nonce through the terminal, and then when you set the nonce on your phone, you would go into like DFU mode, and you go into like DFU mode, for example, and then you would use Feature Restore. Now, Feature Restore is the program that is used for downgrading with blobs. You can't use iTunes. You'd use a program called Feature Restore. You can look it up. And there's one for Windows and Mac OS. And basically, so in a nutshell, and again, this is only for checkmate compatible devices, you would set your nonce to the same one that's in your SSH blob, and there is a whole tutorial I'm not going to go into the details of how to do that. There is a tutorial online. You'll have to look it up and dig around, but there are tutorials for that online. So essentially, you put the device in DFU mode, and then Feature Restore would connect with Apple servers and say, hey, I've got this iPhone 10 here that I want to downgrade to 15.1, and then Apple's gonna be it's gonna talk to Apple servers, and then Apple servers are gonna go and say, okay, well, is the firmware being signed? And this is a very, very basic way of saying it. And Feature Restore is gonna be like, oh, well, I've actually got an SSH blob here, and the generator is the same as the one on the device. So therefore, you should be able to let it downgrade. And again, this is a very basic way of explaining it. There's probably a better way of explaining it. But essentially, when it matches up, Apple server is going to be like, oh, okay, that matches up. You can downgrade. And it will downgrade to 15.1. Now, there's also, now this goes for any device. It does not matter if it's, what I'm about to explain. It goes for any device, whether it's checkmate compatible or non-checkmate compatible, or vulnerable, more so. There is the SCP. Now, if we go and look up the SCP, let's look it up. The SCP is the Secure Enclave, and it's a chip. It's a chip on your iPhone, and it's part of the iPhone. They started putting it in the iPhone 5S. Now, what the Secure Enclave does, it is used for data protection like Touch ID and Face ID, along with other things as well. And it runs its own operating system in the background. So, and whenever you the catch is that you can't downgrade the SCP firmware. That is impossible at the moment. You cannot do that. To do that, you need an SCP exploit, and those are very valuable and dangerous. So, essentially, what would happen is even if you had blobs and you were checkmate compatible or you had a jailbreak, even if you had blobs, let's say, so a good example would be the iPhone 10. So the iPhone 10, if you try to downgrade to 15.1, I believe it's actually 15.3 or lower, if I recall. So if you're on anything higher than 15.3 and you try to downgrade to 15.3 or lower, I did this on my iPhone 10. The SCP is only partially compatible, so it will actually break Face ID. Now you can still have a passcode, but it will break Face ID. Same goes for if you downgrade to 14.8 on an iPhone 10. I mean, it's going to be the same thing. It will break Face ID. And then if you tried to downgrade to like iOS 13, it just flat out wouldn't work. The SCP for iOS 15 is not compatible with iOS 13. They will not work, and the device will refuse to boot. So that's part of the SCP. So you have to make sure, even if you have blobs, you have to make sure that the SCP is compatible. Now, the way you can do that is, this might be out of date. But essentially, GeoSnow here has a good website on here for SCP and baseband compatibility, that kind of thing. Baseband is what allows cellular to work, essentially. So he has been, from what I can tell, he's been staying up to date with this. So for example, here we go, 10. SCP and baseband so this is from 15.6. If you want to downgrade to anything lower than 15.6 and you're already on it, he says SCP and baseband are technically compatible, but restoring to 14.x or 15.31 or lower will break Face ID. Restoring to 15.4, 15.5 is okay. So that's what you have to make sure of if you have blobs, is that the SCP OS is compatible. So that is kind of a little bit of the terminology there. I may go into more specifics in the next video, but that's kind of what it is.